Picture this resume for a second. You are like a seasoned polar explorer who has navigated the really treacherous, crushing ice of the Arctic.
Right.
And you're also a combat veteran of the 7 Years' War, literally hauling gunpowder on the chaotic, deafening gun decks of Royal Navy warships.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's intense.
Right. But wait, there's more. You are also a wildly successful entrepreneur, a radical political activist, and the author of a massive best-selling book that literally changes the course of global legislation.
I mean, if you pitched that life story to a Hollywood studio, they would probably just reject it for being entirely too unrealistic.
Exactly.
You couldn't invent a protagonist who crosses that many historical boundaries. It's too much.
And yet it is meticulously documented reality.
Yeah.
So today, our deep dive is into the life of Olaudah Equiano, a man who, interestingly enough, was actually known for most of his life as Gustavus Vassa.
Yes, which is a key detail.
We are looking at a really fascinating stack of sources today for you. We've got biographical data, some deep historical records, and intense scholarly analysis of his life, specifically his groundbreaking 1789 autobiography.
It's a great stack.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace how one man's sheer willpower and, quite frankly, brilliant storytelling not only secured his own physical freedom, but actively helped dismantle the British slave trade.
Yeah.
And because history refuses to be simple, we're also going to explore a modern historical mystery regarding his very identity.
Which is really the perfect framing for this because, well, many people might recognize Equiano's name from a history class. Understanding the sheer magnitude of what he accomplished requires looking really closely at his mechanics.
Right.
He didn't just survive the systems designed to systematically break him. He studied them, he learned their intricate rules, and then ultimately he weaponized those very systems to tear the institution of slavery apart from the inside.
To understand how he changed the world, we first have to understand the world he was violently forced into.
Right.
Based on his memoir, he was born around 1745 in a village called Asaka, which is in modern-day southern Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through what we know about those early years before everything was just taken from him?
Sure. So according to his own accounts, he was the youngest of 6 surviving sons in a fairly prominent local family.
Okay.
And the defining tragedy of his life happens when he is just 11 years old. It was a common practice for children to be left to look after the family premises while the adults went out to work in the field.
Right, just doing chores.
Exactly. He and his sister were guarding their home when 2 men and a woman literally climbed the walls, attacked them, gagged them, and dragged them far away from their village into the forest.
Just a total catastrophic shattering of his reality in an instant.
Utterly catastrophic. They were separated shortly after, sold to different traders, and, after months of being passed between various enslavers, this terrified 11-year-old boy arrives at the African coast. Oh, wow.
And he is forced into the suffocating hold of a European slave ship.
Which marks the beginning of the Middle Passage. He's transported across the Atlantic Ocean alongside 244 other enslaved Africans.
Yeah.
First they go to Barbados and then on to the colony of Virginia. And it's during this horrific transition that we see the beginning of a systematic, calculated attempt to erase who he was.
It's the psychological warfare of slavery.
Exactly. On the slave ship, the crew decides to call him Michael. Then his first owner in Virginia decides his name is Jacob.
Right.
And then he is bought by Michael Henry Pascal, who is a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, who looks at this child and decides to rename him Gustavus Vassa after a 16th century Swedish king.
And, well, he didn't just accept this. Equiano actually told Pascal he would prefer to be called Jacob, the name he had literally just been forced to learn.
Yeah.
But his refusal, as he wrote later, gained me many a cuff. He was physically beaten by his enslavers until he finally submitted to the new name.
And the haunting part is that this forced name, Gustavus Vassa, is the one he would officially use for the rest of his life.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you think about identity, it is like the fundamental bedrock of your reality. It is the story you tell yourself about who you are.
Absolutely.
So to take an 11-year-old child, rip him from his family, and then repeatedly rename him Michael, Jacob, Gustavus, it's the ultimate erasure of humanity.
Yeah.
It's like trying to forcefully format a human being like a hard drive, just wiping all the previous data to turn a person into pure property.
It is a deliberate, brutal tactic of domination. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Pascal's actions actually carry an incredible historical irony.
Oh, how so?
Well, Pascal takes this young boy back to England and has him serve as his valet during the 7 Years' War.
Okay.
This isn't a sheltered existence at all. Equiano is right there in the absolute thick of global naval warfare. He's experiencing the Siege of Louisbourg, the Battle of Logos. He's trained in advanced seamanship, and his job during combat is hauling heavy gunpowder to the gun decks while literal cannon fire is ripping the ship apart.
So he is literally a combat veteran before he's even a teenager.
Yes. But here is the crucial miscalculation on his enslaver's part. Pascal actually favors the boy and sends Equiano to his sister-in-law in Great Britain so he can attend school.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He learns to read and write fluently in English. He's baptized in 1759. So while Pascal is actively participating in this system that attempts to erase Equiano's African past, he inadvertently hands him the exact tools he needs.
The literacy.
Fluency in English, high-level literacy, and deep naval experience. These are the tools Equiano will eventually use to dismantle the institution holding him captive.
That has to be like one of the greatest unintended consequences in history. But his education and military service didn't suddenly earn him his freedom.
No, not at all. And that leads to just a crushing betrayal. After serving Pascal loyally through the horrors of a global war, expecting freedom, or at least some level of reward, Pascal just turns around in 1762 and sells him to a captain heading back to the Caribbean.
Just throws him back.
Yes. Equiano is reminded brutally that to the British Empire, he is purely liquid capital. He eventually ends up owned by a man named Robert King.
All right.
King was an American Quaker merchant based in Philadelphia who operated these highly lucrative shipping routes in the Caribbean.
But this is where the trajectory drastically shifts, because King puts Equiano to work on his shipping routes. And in 1765, when Equiano is roughly 20 years old, King makes him a promise.
Yeah, a huge promise.
He tells Equiano that if he can come up with his original purchase price, which is 40 pounds, he can literally buy his own freedom.
To give you some economic context here, 40 pounds in the mid-18th century is equivalent to about 1,600 pounds, or roughly 7,500 US dollars today.
Oh, wow.
For an enslaved person who legally owns the clothes on his back and nothing else, that is a monumental, seemingly impossible sum of money to accumulate.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does an enslaved person who legally cannot own property raise the equivalent of over $7,000?
Through an unfathomable level of entrepreneurial hustle, King allowed him to trade on his own account while working on the ships.
Okay.
So Equiano starts sailing between Georgia and the Caribbean, buying and selling fruits, and this requires incredible precision, glass tumblers.
Wait, glass tumblers. Think about the logistics of that. You are on a violently rocking 18th century wooden ship.
Exactly.
Glass breaks so easily. And you have no legal rights whatsoever. Any profit you make could technically be seized by your enslaver at any moment, or just stolen by some white sailor who knows you have zero legal recourse.
Precisely. The sheer stress of managing delicate inventory, negotiating fair prices in hostile ports, and hiding his capital, literally penny by penny, is staggering.
It's mind-blowing.
Yet he navigates this minefield perfectly. And by 1766, he literally hands Robert King the cash and buys his own life back.
He does the impossible. He is a free black man. King actually urges him to stay on as a business partner.
Yeah, he does.
But Equiano leaves. And yet, well, he voluntarily goes back to the sea. He goes on a 1773 expedition toward the North Pole with a doctor named Charles Irving, where they were literally distilling seawater to survive.
Yeah, that really happened.
He travels to the Mosquito Coast. He even goes back to colonies like Georgia, where he was nearly kidnapped and forced back into slavery. It completely baffles me. Why on earth would a newly freed man put himself in such precarious, terrifyingly dangerous situations instead of just staying safely in London?
It seems counterintuitive, right? Until you look at the harsh landscape of the 18th century, the sea was incredibly dangerous, yes. But the deck of a ship was one of the very few meritocratic spaces available to a black man at that time.
Right.
A hurricane doesn't care about your legal status or the color of your skin. It only cares if you know how to rig a sail and read the currents.
Wow, so the ocean was basically his only equalizer.
Exactly. At sea, Equiano's profound maritime skills had immediate, undeniable value. It allowed him to earn a living, to travel globally, and to exercise his agency in a world that, on land, was constantly trying to strip that agency away.
He secures his own survival. But eventually, his focus shifts from his own freedom to the freedom of others. By the 1780s, Equiano has settled down in London.
Right.
He joins a group called the Sons of Africa, composed of free Africans living in Britain, and he starts leveraging his incredible network.
And this is where his deep knowledge of maritime law and his activism sort of collide. In 1783, Equiano is the one who goes to the prominent abolitionist Granville Sharp with horrifying news about a ship called the Zong.
For those who might not know the details of the Zong massacre, it is one of the darkest moments in maritime history.
Yeah.
Can you explain what Equiano brought to Sharp?
Yeah. The Zong was a British slave ship. The crew had mismanaged their water supplies, and rather than letting the enslaved Africans die of thirst, which would be considered a loss at the expense of the ship's owners,
Right.
the crew intentionally threw more than 130 enslaved people overboard to their deaths. They did this specifically so the ship's owners could claim the financial loss of the quote-unquote cargo on their insurance.
The clinical bureaucratic brutality of that is just sickening.
It is. But Equiano bringing this to Granville Sharp was a masterstroke of strategy. When this went to court, it wasn't a murder trial.
Wow.
Under British law, it was an insurance litigation trial. By exposing this in the heart of London's legal system, Equiano and Sharp forced the British public to look directly at the cold, bureaucratic reality of the slave trade.
They couldn't ignore it anymore.
Right. They couldn't pretend it was some civilized mission. Human lives were literally being calculated as cargo to be written off on insurance forms.
And it wasn't just the broad statistics of the Zong that fueled his activism. He experienced the terror firsthand through his friend, a free black cook named John Annis.
Yes. Annis was living in London, seemingly protected by the Somerset case of 1772.
Which was a big deal.
Right. It was a landmark ruling which essentially stated that an enslaved person could not be forcibly removed from England and sent back to a colony to be enslaved. But Annis's former enslaver completely ignored English common law.
Just ignored it.
Yeah, he hired thugs to kidnap Annis right off a British ship in the Thames and shipped him to St. Kitts, where he was brutally worked to death.
Equiano and Granville Sharp tried desperately to save Annis through the legal system, right?
They did. They filed writs, they went to the courts, and they completely failed. The law offered no real protection. This event profoundly shook Equiano.
I can imagine.
He even temporarily questioned his Christian faith over the profound injustice of a system that would allow this. It proved to him that playing by the legal rules wasn't going to save them.
It just blows my mind that an empire built on the massive foundational profits of slavery was somehow undone by a memoir.
Yeah.
Like decades of politicians couldn't ban the slave trade through the courts. How did one guy with a book actually pull it off?
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of human empathy. Political lobbying and legal battles often rely on statistics or, philosophical arguments.
Right.
Statistics inform people, but personal narratives build empathy. For the vast majority of the white British public, the brutal reality of the slave trade was happening an ocean away.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. Sugar and tobacco just magically arrived at the docks.
So his autobiography was essentially a Trojan horse. He smuggled the unfiltered, horrific reality of the slave trade past the polite, willful ignorance of British drawing rooms by disguising it as an engaging literary adventure.
That is the perfect analogy. In 1789, he publishes the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African.
Quite a title.
And he wrote with incredible literary style, rich imagery, and profound emotional depth. He detailed his childhood, his fears, his Christian faith, and his immense grief. He proved, undeniably, the complex humanity of Africans. It became a massive blockbuster, going through 9 editions. He shattered the racist justifications used to uphold the trade by making the political deeply, uncomfortably personal for every reader.
And he doesn't just stop at the book. He becomes famous, wealthy, and independent. But instead of quietly enjoying his success, he gets involved in some highly radical, dangerous politics.
Oh, he was a true agitator. For instance, he was appointed as a commissary, which is essentially a government logistics officer, to help resettle London's quote-unquote black poor in a new colony in Sierra Leone.
Okay.
But he was fired from that position.
Wait, how does he get fired from a project meant to help his own community?
By loudly whistleblowing, he realized the white officials running the project were hoarding supplies and mismanaging the finances, putting the settlers' lives at real risk. So instead of playing along, he wrote furious letters to newspapers, called out the corruption publicly, and demanded accountability. He refused to just be a quiet, grateful figurehead.
He also started touring the British Isles, promoting his book. And while doing that, he was brokering connections between the London Corresponding Society which was a radical working-class group campaigning for democratic reform, and the United Irishmen.
Yes.
Now, for those who don't know, the United Irishmen were an underground group actively plotting an armed rebellion against British rule. He was lodging with people who were later charged with high treason.
Which perfectly illustrates the sheer breadth of his vision. He wasn't just fighting against the transatlantic slave trade anymore.
Right.
He was increasingly connecting his struggle to broader systems of inequality and undemocratic power across the British Isles. He saw the threads connecting all oppressed people.
So what does this all mean? We have this monumental historical figure, but this brings us to the modern historical mystery. In 1999, a scholar named Vincent Corretta was doing archival research and he dropped a bombshell.
A massive bombshell.
He found a 1759 parish baptismal record for Equiano and a later naval muster roll. And both of these administrative documents listed his birthplace not as Africa, but as South Carolina.
This discovery sent absolute shockwaves through the historical and literary communities. Because if he was actually born in South Carolina, it means the harrowing early chapters of his book, the idyllic childhood in Osaka, the violent kidnapping, the visceral horrors of the Middle Passage, they might have been unscripted from the lived experiences of others rather than his own firsthand memories.
Wait, so the argument is that he fabricated his own origin story. How do other historians respond to that?
Well, they aggressively push back. Scholars like Paul Lovejoy and Adam Hochschild argue that the overwhelming circumstantial evidence still supports his African birth.
Okay.
Hochschild makes a brilliant point regarding the nature of memoirs. When you study autobiographies, writers either distort a lot of things to make themselves look good, or they largely tell the truth. Yep. Seldom does an autobiographer invent one massive, completely fabricating lie while keeping the rest of the text scrupulously, verifiably accurate. And Equiano's account of the slave trade matches up perfectly with historical records of the 1750s.
It's almost like modern investigative journalism. Imagine you are researching a famous historical figure today, and you find an old census record that conflicts with their published life story.
Yeah.
Does a bureaucratic, administrative error entirely rewrite a person's origin story? Or did a British military clerk just lazily assume the origins of an enslaved boy based on where a ship had last sailed from?
This raises an important question about how we weigh historical documentation. On one hand, you have two official written records from the 18th century saying Carolina.
Right.
On the other hand, you have his detailed, culturally accurate memories and the knowledge that military clerks rarely interrogated enslaved children about their true origins. We have to remain impartial to the debate itself because we simply may never know for absolute certain where he drew his first breath. But what is vital to remember is that this scholarly debate doesn't actually diminish the impact of his life.
Right. Regardless of his exact birthplace, the detailed accuracy of his experiences within the slave trade, his time surviving at sea, and his brilliant navigation of British high society, all of that remains an undisputed cornerstone of this historical record.
His activism was undeniably real. His impact on the 18th century world was real. The legislation he helped inspire literally changed the globe.
It is a phenomenal trajectory. We are talking about a man who started as a terrified enslaved child, became a combat veteran hauling gunpowder, an Arctic explorer distilling seawater, a self-taught entrepreneur trading glass, a best-selling author, and a key architect of the abolitionist movement. And his modern legacy is uniquely bizarre and widespread. Today, he has a bridge named after him in Cambridge.
Wow.
He has a crater named after him on the planet Mercury. There's an exoplanet that bears his name. In 2019, Google Cloud named a massive subsea cable running from Portugal to South Africa after him.
That is amazing. And all of those incredibly diverse honors reflect how his story resonates across completely different disciplines: literature, politics, maritime exploration, and now global technology.
Yeah?
His life is the ultimate masterclass in refusing to let a brutally unjust system define your limits. He was stripped of his name, his freedom, and his home.
Yep.
But he educated himself, he found his voice, and he proved that sharing your authentic story can quite literally alter the course of human history.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, listening right now, with one final provocative thought to mull over. We mentioned at the start of our conversation that he was repeatedly renamed, eventually forced to accept the name Gustavus Vassa.
Right.
And he hated it. But when you look at his everyday life as a free man, his marriage record to his wife Susanna Cullen in 1792,
Okay.
the baptismal records of his two daughters, and even his official will, where he left his hard-earned wealth to a school in Sierra Leone and a missionary society.
Wow.
In all of those deeply personal legal documents, he almost exclusively used the name Gustavus Vassa.
That is the ultimate paradox of his life. He lived, married, and died under the name his enslaver gave him. He primarily only used the name Olaudah Equiano for his autobiography and his public activism.
So I want you to consider this. When history remembers you entirely by a name you seemingly only used in one book, does that name reflect who you truly were in the quiet moments of your daily life? Or does it simply reflect the symbol you knew you needed to become in order to change the world? We started by talking about how his resume reads like absolute fiction: the explorer, the sailor, the activist.
Right.
But maybe the most incredible thing he ever created wasn't just his wealth or his best-selling book. Maybe his greatest creation was the legendary persona of Olaudah Equiano itself.